Let's create a dynamic custom tooltip in HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. As we hover over an item, a tooltip will appear with smooth transitional animation, and as we exit, it'll disappear with the same smooth transitional animation. There's options to place the tooltip on top or place it on the bottom. And as you can see within the tooltip, it is very customizable so that you can have HTML with various styling. And if you want, insert images within your tooltips as well. The tooltip also has dynamic placement so that if it's going to be off the page, it will be repositioned appropriately so that the tooltip is within the page's viewport, as we can see here. Likewise. So let's check out how this is built. We'll start with the HTML markup, and here we'll see that we have 3 h1 tags. And this is more just to kind of give some spacing between them, enough padding and margin so that they're well spaced apart so that we'll be able to scroll up and down to be able to show the different functionality that the tooltip has. The real crux of it all is here. So we'll see that within the h1 tag, the main thing that distinguishes an element for having a tooltip is by having this attribute here that says data tooltip. This is significant because it indicates that this is an element that we want to have a tooltip appear above or below on. In this particular case, we want to have the tooltip appear towards the bottom, and so I'm specifying an equal sign and assigning it a value of bottom. Otherwise, it's understood to have a default value of top. And within the element that is going to have the tooltip associated with it, you can have any number of HTML within it, but the key content that will appear in your tooltip will be wrapped around a HTML element that has a class of tooltip content. This will not appear on the page itself, but only will appear once the mouse is over the element that we want to have a tooltip appear on. The next thing to cover is the CSS. This CSS class represents this element here, mainly that it will be hidden and with an opacity of 0 to make sure that it does not display at all while the tooltip is not active. Tooltip, it's going to have a background of white, it's going to be position fixed, and this is very different from being positioned absolutely, because absolutely means it's going to be still relative to the page scrolling, and you do not want that. You want it to be position fixed. It's going to have initial visibility of hidden with some padding, some drop shadows. Opacity will be low, and then it will gradually transition to 1 when it's active with an active class. It's going to have a minimum width and as well as some border radius, and we're going to use z-index to make sure it's at the very top of everything else that's on the page. And this is going to be a little arrow that's going to be within the tooltip that allows it to point towards what it's a tooltip for. Essentially, it's just a div with some rotations on it. It's going to have a background of white and some minimum width and height. The JavaScript is the glue that makes everything work, and here I'll be using a delegated function. Check out my video on delegated functions to be able to get a replication of this function. In essence, whenever this event, a mouse over or touch over, happens on anything that has a data tooltip attribute on it, such as in this case, then we will be executing the body of this function. And so whenever the mouse is over this type of element, we then will use a timeout to wait about 80 milliseconds. We will call this function, and this function is responsible for checking to see if the mouse is still currently over the element that we originally were waiting on. So we do not want to show our tooltip immediately upon entering the element. Instead, we want to wait about 80 milliseconds, and then we will then run this function to check to see where the mouse's current position is. And if that position is still directly over the element that we're interested in, then in that case, we'll say show tooltip. And the main reason why we have this event listener is because we want to continuously be checking the mouse position so that we can then use it within this function here to then check to see where the mouse currently is relative to what the user was hovering over. If it's not, we stop everything, and we have already deregistered the event listeners that we were listening for. And so the definition of this function is mainly to pass in the storage location of where the mouse X and Y positions happens to be. Don't worry, the link to this code will be available on my website. Please check out the link below. Once we determine that the mouse is still over the element that we're interested in, we call show tooltip, And within ToolTip, we make sure that the element that has the data ToolTip attribute on it does not already have a ToolTip that's active via this active class. And if it does have it already, then we exit. Otherwise, we then continue and then apply the active ToolTip class onto it. And next, what happens is that we dynamically create a ToolTip by creating a div and append it to the bottom of the page, as in here. And the element that the user is immediately on top of, we apply a mouse leave event listener to it, so that anytime the user exits this element, we will then clean up the tooltip that we are dynamically creating by calling on exit. More on this in a moment. Using the actual elements that has a data tooltip attribute on it, we will then get the contents of the tooltip, such as in this example. And if it does not exist, we exit. Otherwise, we will then apply the tooltip onto this dynamic div that we created. And then within this dynamic tooltip div that we are creating, we'll then inject the contents of this tooltip contents into the dynamically created tooltip div, and of course append it to the page itself. And as I mentioned, the definition of this function is going to be this. In essence, we are removing the active tooltip class on the element with the data tooltip. We're removing the event listener that we created down here. And then we're marking the tooltip as visible to keep it visible as it slowly animates out from opacity of 1 to 0. And then we'll wait about 250 milliseconds and then remove the tooltip div after it has completed its animation. Because of how HTML works, we're not able to get the dimensions of an element immediately upon insertion, so we have to wait a little bit in able to get its correct dimension. In this case, after inserting the tooltip into the document, we will then wait about 120 milliseconds to then get the accurate sizing, and then we'll use that sizing in able to accurately place the tooltip with respect to the element that it's a tooltip for. So here we're just creating a padding, setting up some initial variables that tells us how big the window currently is. And then because we've waited long enough, we will then get the size of the actual tooltip bounding rectangle, which is going to be this H1 tag, and then the tooltip rectangle itself. And then we'll use that to accurately place, and then we'll use the sizing information to correctly place the elements above or below the elements. Here's where we identify the preference of the user as to whether or not we want it to be placed on top or below. You'll see that it defaults to top if nothing is specified. And then based on the preference, we will then toggle the placement either above or below. And lastly, we do a modified force placement for the horizontal axis by using a conditional expression. And this conditional expression was defined up here. That just checked to see if the rectangle plus the width of the tooltip is less than the width of the window. And if it is, we place it to the left, otherwise we place it to the right. And those of course are defined up here. And so with that, we are able to specify a dynamic custom tooltip with full HTML that is responsive to the placement of the window viewport. My name is Solus Code. Thank you for checking out this video. If you enjoy the content, please give a like. Until next time, check out my other videos.